All right. Something happened in Washington, D.C. today that at the surface level was the most banal, the most run-of-the-mill thing in the entire universe. It was the most expected, least surprising thing, and it will probably appear on page A19 of tomorrow's newspaper. Today in Washington, the United States Senate rejected an attempt to end oil industry subsidies. Why wasn't that surprising? Because President Obama was for ending those oil subsidies, so were Democrats in the Senate, but the Republicans filibustered, and so it died. That 3-bullet point explanation can basically be said about everything that has happened in Washington since 2010, more or less. But if you just think about it for a second, in this particular case, if you don't accept it at face value and you instead take this case, hold it up to the light and turn it 15 degrees to see it at a new angle, it is downright bizarre that this happened. It is a true mystery that at a time when deficit scaremongering rules the Beltway and fiscal probity is the flavor of the month, when nobody likes the oil companies, the Democrats have a majority in the Senate and a president in the White House, they weren't able to pluck this eminently low-hanging fruit. It is a mystery, a classic Washington caper. Why does this particular piece of policy persist? There's a few possible reasons. Maybe it's because this is a popular piece of policy, right? Nope, that can't be it. The NBC News polled on the issue last year and found that 74% of Americans, 74% would like to do away with this policy. 3/4 of Americans would be in favor of eliminating tax subsidies for the oil and gas industries. And every year, Gallup polls people on how they feel about various industries in this country. And out of the 25 industries they polled on last year, the oil and gas industry came in 24th place in terms of favorability. Okay, so the oil and gas industry is not very popular. The policy itself is not very popular. Well, then maybe it's the case that subsidizing the oil and gas industry is a good piece of policy. It might be unpopular, but economists everywhere recognize it is fundamentally sound. But that's not it either. Economists on the left have long argued for the elimination of oil subsidies, and here's the view from the right. Eliminating oil subsidies. 2 cheers for President Obama. That's from the Libertarian Cato Institute. This from the Conservative Heritage Foundation, quote, ending all energy subsidies, including those for oil and gas, would be good for American taxpayers and consumers. Okay, so it's actually not universally recognized as good policy. Maybe this is an industry that's on life support and needs the help. Nobody liked the auto bailout, but saving the auto industry was good for the overall U.S. economy. So maybe it's not optimal policy and it's not popular, but it's just one of those things we kind of need to suck it up and do because the oil and gas industries are in such dire straits. Except, well, obviously not. The oil and gas industry is quite literally the most profitable industry in the history of humankind. The big oil companies essentially mint money. In the most recent quarter, the top 5 oil companies made a combined profit of $32 billion. Okay, well, finally, maybe there's just a durable, robust, partisan divide on this issue where people on different sides of the aisle just see the facts of the matter so differently they cannot reconcile them. They can't come to the kind of consensus needed to get it over the hump. Maybe Republicans are just 100% fundamentally opposed to the idea of ending oil subsidies.
I will tell you, with $55 oil, we don't need incentives to oil and gas companies to explore. There's plenty of incentive.
I voted to wipe out many of the oil company subsidies. They're doing just fine on their own.
We simply should not expect taxpayers struggling to pay their energy bills to continue to subsidize the oil industry.
Look, I said everything's on the table, and that includes ethanol. That includes all subsidies.
Oil and gas subsidies?
On the table.
On the table.
If, in fact, they are making such enormous profits, then perhaps they don't need the support and the tax incentives that are given to them by the American taxpayer, by the United States Congress.
Would you be in favor of seeing some of these subsidies that are going to big oil at times of record profits?
It's certainly something that we ought to be looking at.
Of doing away with these subsidies.
We're at a time when the federal government's short on revenues. We need to control spending, but we need to have revenues to keep the government moving, and they ought to be paying their fair share.
All right, so that's not it either. Even President Bush, the quintessential Republican oil man, is on record saying we don't need oil subsidies. In fact, here are the heads of the top 5 oil companies themselves admitting on tape, under oath, what they think of the oil subsidies.
Gentlemen, the President says, and I quote, with $55 oil, we don't need incentives to oil and gas companies to explore. There are plenty of incentives. Now, today, the price of oil is above $55 per barrel. Is the President wrong when he says we don't need incentives for oil and gas exploration? If I could just have a yes or no answer and go right down the road, beginning with you, Mr. Raymond. Is the President wrong?
No, and I don't think our companies ask for any incentives for exploration.
Sir?
Agreed.
What?
In my oral comments, I said we do not need. What we do need, though, is access.
Just a yes or a no.
Access, yes.
Sir?
No.
President's correct?
He's correct.
Sir?
Yes, he is.
All right, just to recap, this is an unpopular piece of policy. It's economically sensitive. It's aiding an industry that is already one of the most profitable in the world, that the Democratic president is against, that Democrats in Congress are against, and the Republicans in the past have also said they're against. And yet, repealing, well, we can't seem to repeal it. It fails. It fails to pass out of even one chamber of Congress. And not just this year. It fails year after year. Today, when I was Googling around to find articles about this, I kept getting almost identical headlines from previous years. It turns out we go through this almost every single year. In fact, I'm almost positive I actually guest hosted for Rachel on a previous night when the Republicans in Congress had knocked down a bill to repeal oil subsidies. So when I said earlier this was a caper, that this is a true mystery, the mystery again is, why does this persist? When it's unpopular policy, when it's bad policy, when Democrats hate it, Republicans have in the past supported getting rid of it, why does it persist? And the most plausible way to figure out who done it in this case is just to take a look at who voted for the oil subsidies today and who voted against them, and then look at how much money those two groups got from big oil. 51 members of the Senate, mostly Democrats, voted against the oil industry today. They voted to repeal the oil subsidies, and collectively they've received about $5 million in campaign contributions from big oil. The 47 senators who voted to protect the oil industry subsidies today, they got this much money from big oil, nearly $25 million. If this were a game of Clue, I think we've just solved the mystery. It was big oil with the wallet in the cloakroom. You see, the oil industry is a very concentrated industry. There aren't a lot of mom and pop oil companies around. I mean, there are some, but it's mainly the top 5 oil companies, at least here domestically. Some of the most recent data available shows that in the United States, the top 5 oil companies control over half the domestic oil refinery capacity. It's not a monopolistic market. It's what economists would call an oligopolistic market. It's a concentrated market. When Teddy Roosevelt, back in the Gilded Age, started going around advancing the idea of breaking up oligopolistic markets and monopolies, he wasn't concerned primarily with the thing that we tend to talk about and obsess over now, which is the way that those kind of market concentration affects consumer prices. No, what Teddy Roosevelt worried about back when he was working on concentrated economic power is the way that that concentrated economic power would skew the political system. If our political institutions were perfect, they would absolutely prevent the political domination of money in any part of our affairs. There are not a few public men who, though they would repel with indignation and offer of a bribe, will give certain corporations special legislative and executive privileges because they have contributed heavily to campaign funds. In other words, Teddy Roosevelt was worried about a result just like what we saw today. Even though we have something that's bad policy, that everyone sort of agrees is bad policy, when it comes down to brass tacks, we can't get rid of it. And why can't we get rid of it? You're looking at it. Teddy Roosevelt's nightmare come true.